You were never meant to hear this. In 1851, a sealed letter was discovered inside a hollowed-out pew in the Sacred Heart Seminary chapel. It was unsigned, its edges burned, and the ink half erased by time. The only words still legible? They are not men of God. They wear his robes, but they serve another master. That letter was never logged, never reported. It vanished into the hands of Bishop Quarter and was locked away in the diocesan vault. Until now. What you're about to hear isn't folklore, it isn't exaggeration, and it isn't safe. This is the forbidden story of 10 priests who disappeared, one by one, over 30 years from Sacred Heart Seminary. But they didn't run. They were taken, used, silenced. And if you listen to what I'm about to reveal, something in you will never go back to sleep. Everything began in silence. Not the peaceful kind, but the kind that smothers, the silence of institutions built not on truth but control. Sacred Heart Seminary, nestled among the blood-soaked plains of central Illinois, was supposed to be a refuge, a fortress of faith during the storm of America's expansion. But inside those Gothic stone walls, something older than the church had taken root, something that fed on ritual, obedience, and isolation. Behind the stained glass windows, masked in incense and Gregorian chants, power games were unfolding that had nothing to do with God. Every brick of that seminary was funded not just by gold, but by fear. Fear of the Protestant mobs burning convents, fear of spiritual collapse, fear that the Irish Catholic identity could be erased in a foreign land. And when people are afraid, they don't look too closely at the men they trust. They hand over their sons. They sign the checks. They obey. But what if the men you trusted weren't priests at all? What if they wore the collar not to preach, but to hunt? The church's official story says, these 10 priests were transferred, reassigned, or lost to cholera. But buried letters, intercepted by gravediggers, unearthed by construction crews, leaked by archivists, tell a different story. These men didn't vanish. They were systematically removed, selected like cattle, and offered up to something beneath the surface, not metaphorically, literally. This story isn't just about 10 missing men. It's about a machine built on obedience, a temple that masked a tomb, and a system that punishes questions with disappearance. You're not watching a video, you're crossing a line. And once you see what lies beneath Sacred Heart, you won't be able to look away. The first rule of control is simple: isolate the subject. Sacred Heart Seminary was designed to do exactly that, not just spiritually but physically. 40 miles from the nearest city, no trains, no telegraph lines, no neighbors for miles, only miles of prairie, wind, and whispers. This was not an accident. It was architecture as imprisonment, cloaked in holiness. The young men who entered its gates were told they were chosen, special, called. But chosen for what? That question only had one answer, and none of them lived long enough to speak it. Let me show you how it worked. Upon admission, each seminarian was stripped of all outside contact. 1 letter per month, all mail filtered through the rector's office, no visits without approval, no travel without escort. Even prayer, something meant to be private, was observed. Every step they took, every word they spoke, was watched by men who claimed to represent God. But behind those robes, lies. Father Edmund Walsh, Rector Thomas Murphy, Dean Patrick O'Brien, the Holy Trinity of Sacred Heart, all 3 supposedly educated in Europe's finest seminaries, all 3 bearing letters of recommendation no one ever verified. Because why would they? They wore the collar. They spoke Latin, they knew the rituals, but none of their names appeared in the Vatican's registry, and Maynooth Seminary, no record of Edmund Walsh ever enrolling, not one. They were ghosts, and ghosts leave no footprints. What these men built at Sacred Heart wasn't a school, it was a funnel, a carefully engineered system designed to sort, study, and select vulnerable young men, not for ministry but for exploitation. The seminary's rigorous curriculum, it wasn't education, it was testing, obedience, endurance, psychological malleability, and those who passed, they didn't graduate, they disappeared. Some say they were trafficked to remote monasteries in Soti, America. Others believe they were sacrificed in dark rites meant to invoke ancient power under the guise of apostolic tradition. But the truth may be worse, because some of them were never seen again, not in life or in death, no bodies, no graves, just echoes in the stone walls. The seminary archives, once sealed, now reveal the pattern. Every 3 years, like clockwork, one promising student would vanish under unusual circumstances, always in winter, always during storms, always when investigation would be hardest, and always the same phrase in the registry beside their name, transferred to Divine Mercy Outpost. There is no Divine Mercy Outpost. There never was. So where did they go? Or, better yet, what took them? The deeper you go, the quieter it gets. Not because there's nothing there, because something doesn't want to be heard. Sacred Heart Seminary didn't just bury its secrets. It designed rituals to erase them. You see, these weren't ordinary priests running the show. They were masters of symbolic control, men who understood how to use liturgy as hypnosis, how to turn ceremony into sedation. The chapel wasn't a house of worship. It was a stage, a spell. And the students, they were the audience, lulled by scripture, blinded by incense, chanting their own submission. One former altar boy, now institutionalized for decades, muttered in Latin for years, Domine non sum dignus, et ideo sacrificatus sum. Lord, I am not worthy, and therefore I was sacrificed. No one listened. They gave him lithium. But the words never stopped. Ask yourself this: why were so many students with elite potential, future leaders of the American Catholic Church, allowed to disappear without real investigation? Why were their names never published in the diocesan bulletins? Why were their families pacified with forged letters, each one ending with the same phrase, "I trust in God's plan and my superior's wisdom"? Every single letter. Identical handwriting, different names. It took nearly 60 years for anyone to notice the pattern. By then, it was too late. Let's talk about the basement. The crypt, as it was jokingly called, wasn't part of the original architectural plans. The blueprints filed with the Illinois Office of Records in 1845 make no mention of substructures beneath the chapel, but when an earthquake shook the area in 1907, a sinkhole opened beneath the western wing. Rescue workers found not just soil, but stone stairs leading down. What they uncovered, before the bishop's men sealed it off, was a room no one will talk about, but I found the testimony of one man who was there. A firefighter died in 1921. His grandson kept the journal. He wrote, "It was colder than the grave. No light, but we could see the shapes. Carved stone pillars, symbols I'd never seen, not Latin, older, and cages, iron cages, like something from an inquisition." What were they doing down there? This wasn't about faith. It was about fear and how it can be molded, weaponized. The seminary wasn't just training priests. It was testing mind control, breaking men, rebuilding them, or discarding them. And still, no one speaks of it, because speaking is how the curse spreads. Are you ready to hear more? There's a name that's never been spoken from the pulpit, never published in any seminary registry, never etched into marble or wood. But it appears again and again in the margins of forbidden documents, scribbled in the trembling hands of those who tried to leave Sacred Heart and failed. The name is Calyx Regis, Latin for the King's Cup. But this was no holy grail. It was a society, secret, ritualistic, and built not to glorify God, but to glorify obedience through annihilation. Calyx Regis was not a club. It was a filter. By their second year, every seminarian underwent something called the Night of Submission. It was never listed on the schedule, never spoken of aloud, but every graduate from Sacred Heart in the 1850s bore a scar on the inside of their left wrist, thin precise, ritualistic, the shape of a chalice with a crown above it. Those who asked about it were told, "It is a vow between man and heaven." But heaven doesn't demand flesh. The records we do have, stolen by a monk who fled the seminary in 1864, suggest something far darker. In his final confession he wrote, "The cup is not metaphor, the king is not Christ, and the blood we drank was not symbolic." Let that settle in for a moment. Because what happens when a religious order replaces faith with loyalty? When truth becomes a liability? You don't build disciples, you build tools, instruments, flesh-bound weapons designed to obey, obey, obey. Sacred Heart wasn't alone. There were others, mirror institutions across the Midwest, all reporting to the same silent authority. But Sacred Heart was the origin, the root, the place where obedience was perfected and the soul was ritualistically reshaped into a mechanism of silence. One survivor, now living under witness protection, described the chapel during these midnight ceremonies: black veils over the crucifixes, red candles in place of white, scriptures, a spoken backward, and Gregorian chants reduced to low guttural hums that shook the ribcage. They called it reversal mass, but it wasn't just a parody. It was a psycho-spiritual reset, a breaking of identity. It was mind control, masquerading as penance. This is how 10 men disappeared over 30 years without a single investigation. They weren't missing. They were transformed, or buried. And here's the part that should terrify you. The Calyx Regis didn't die when the seminary closed. It relocated. You want to know the most dangerous thing about evil? It doesn't announce itself. It whispers in robes, it kneels beside you, it smiles with clean hands and holy words, and by the time you realize what it is, you're already inside its cathedral. When Sacred Heart Seminary officially shut its doors in 1876, the official statement cited declining enrollment and financial strain, but internal correspondence, hidden until the archives were breached in 1989, tells a different story. A Vatican emissary arrived in secret. No public visit, no papal blessing. He met with Walsh behind locked doors for 3 days. On the 4th day, construction began on a sub-level that never appeared on maps. On the 5th, the students were gone. Every single one, not transferred, not graduated, erased. The building was padlocked, the grounds left to rot. Nature swallowed the roads, prairie grass reclaimed the trails, but late into the 20th century, locals whispered that lights still glowed inside the chapel windows on certain nights, candles in impossible places, shadows moving against the glass where no one should walk. It gets worse. A year after closure, a new name appeared on ecclesiastical records: Order of the Chalice Kings, unaffiliated. No diocese claimed them, no bishops signed their charter. But they received funding, large amounts, from private Catholic families, old money, names like Connolly, Tiernan, and O'Malley. Sound familiar? Those names funded Sacred Heart. What happened was not a dissolution. It was a migration. The machine simply moved, the rituals continued under a new banner, and the men? They changed robes, switched locations, but the purpose was unchanged: control the devout, exploit the obedient, sacrifice the pure. By 1903, a mysterious theological retreat center appeared in northern Missouri, Sanctum Calicis. On paper, it was a place of deep spiritual discipline for advanced clergy. But former delivery workers described underground wings, barred doors, guards who wouldn't speak, and guests who arrived but never left. Coincidence or continuity? Look deeper. Even today, that property remains inaccessible. No visitors, no press, no photography. And it's funded by a trust connected directly to the Archdiocese of Chicago. This isn't just history. It's infrastructure. They built a system that can't be exposed because it's hiding behind the most untouchable mask: religion. But I'm not asking you to believe me yet. I'm asking you to stay with me. Because in Section 6, we go deeper into a document not meant for any civilian's eyes. It was never supposed to leave the Vatican, but it did. And I have it. There are documents so dangerous that even the Church hides them from itself. This one was labeled Archivum Obscurum, Classis 13. It wasn't stored in a library. It was sealed inside lead, buried beneath the Vatican Apostolic Archive, and known only to a council of 5 cardinals sworn to absolute silence. But one page, just one, was photographed by a rogue archivist in 1974 before he vanished. What it revealed was not dogma. It was protocol, a blueprint for psychological manipulation under the guise of clerical formation. And at the top of that document, stamped in crimson ink, was a phrase you will never forget. Sacramentum umbrae, the sacrament of the shadow. This was not theology. This was indoctrination. The document outlines a sequence of 7 rites used to fracture identity, reinforce loyalty, and erase moral resistance. These rites were to be administered not to willing adults, but to adolescent seminarians, young men chosen for their suggestibility, obedience, and most disturbingly, lack of family oversight. Let me be clear, this wasn't about forming priests. This was about forming tools. The Sacrament of the Shadow describes rituals involving deprivation, symbolic death, staged exorcisms, enforced confessions of imagined sins, and hours, sometimes days, of sensory distortion, light, sound, isolation. The result? A mind that doesn't know where it ends, and obedience begins. You might ask, who authorized this? The document was signed by Cardinal Valerio Luciani, a name you won't find in public Vatican records, but whose influence appears in secret correspondence tied to dozens of mysterious disappearances in church institutions across Europe and the Americas. And beneath his signature, one word, scrawled by hand, Regis, not Christus, not Deus, but Regis, of the King. The same name burned into the wrists of Sacred Heart's vanished students. This is no coincidence. This is a system that reaches deeper than the Church dares admit. And Sacred Heart, it wasn't a rogue experiment, it was a prototype. And the final phase? Replace memory with myth. Convince the world it never happened. But it did. And if you're still watching, you're already part of something dangerous. Because the algorithm wasn't supposed to let this video spread. The Church's influence reaches further than pulpit and pew. It runs through media, through history, through bloodlines. But you just broke through the veil. And in Section 7 we reveal what really happened to the final priest who tried to blow the whistle, and how he died, speaking in tongues not of God but of something older. He was the last one to try. Father Elias Rourke, ordained in 1869, assigned to Sacred Heart in its final winter. He wasn't like the others. He'd grown up Protestant, converted during the war after surviving a Confederate prison camp. He had seen death, real death. And when he arrived at Sacred Heart, he said the silence in the walls was worse than the screams he'd heard in Andersonville. He kept a journal. That's how we know what happened. It was discovered 98 years later, hidden inside the hollow spine of a Latin textbook stored in a church basement in Joliet. Bound in leather, written in tight, looping cursive. It begins like any priest's diary, prayers, questions, doubt. But by entry 43, his tone changes. They do not teach, they extract. They do not preach, they implant. Last night I saw Brother Ansel weeping in his cell, his fingernails torn off. He claimed it was penance, but his eyes said otherwise. By entry 61, the Mass has changed. There is no Eucharist, no body of Christ, only a chalice of brine and silence. I heard Dean O'Brien chant something not in Latin. My skin crawled. I recognized syllables from a book I burned during my time in Cairo, hieroglyphs that speak not of gods, but of mouths that open beneath the earth. Rourke tried to leave, twice. Each time he was brought back, bound, drugged, and purified. He wrote of losing time, of waking in robes he didn't remember putting on, of speaking phrases he didn't understand, while the others clapped in rhythm. Then came the final entry. It was short, just 4 words. The king is awake. Rourke's body was found weeks later, but not on the seminary grounds. He was discovered in a root cellar 2 miles west, stripped naked, mouth packed with communion wafers, eyes gouged clean, but no blood, not 1 drop. The local sheriff claimed animal attack, but the coroner's notes, suppressed until 1984, tell a different story. His organs were reversed, his lungs where his liver should be, his stomach coiled into the shape of a chalice. The church buried the case, buried the evidence, buried the man, but not his journal, not the truth, and not the thing that woke up under Sacred Heart Seminary in the winter of 1876, because whatever Rourke saw in that chapel, it wasn't from this world. What if the seminary wasn't just a building? What if it was a gate, a threshold, a mouth? After Father Rourke's death, Sacred Heart was abandoned. At least that's what the records say. But locals tell another story. For years after its closure, strange lights flickered from the chapel windows. Chanting, low, rhythmic, unnatural, was heard echoing across the prairie on windless nights, and animals refused to go near the grounds. Farmers reported cows collapsing near the outer fence. Dogs whined, dug into the dirt, and refused to move forward. Horses bucked riders at the first sight of the bell tower. The land itself had changed. You can't build a place of pain without consequence. The rituals that happened beneath those vaulted ceilings didn't just damage people, they damaged the fabric of reality. The basement wasn't just a basement. That staircase uncovered during the 1907 earthquake, it led deeper than any human hand had dug. Surveyors sent to map it stopped at 30 feet. Compasses spun. Equipment failed. 2 men never came back. The state sealed the area, citing geological instability. But the soil around the seminary is chemically unique, rich in magnetite, quartz, and a rare compound resembling monoatomic gold, the same material rumored to have been used in ancient Egypt's priestly elixirs, material that, when activated by vibration, say by Gregorian chant in reverse, alters consciousness. Sound familiar? You see, Sacred Heart wasn't just a place of indoctrination, it was an engine, built to test human limits, built to reach something below. One forgotten document from the seminary's early construction notes, a deviation in the foundation plan. The words are scratched in red. Beneath lies the vault. Dig no further without the crown's key. That phrase, the crown's key, appears nowhere else in church architecture. It is not Catholic. It is older. We are talking pre-Roman, pre-Christian, pre-human. The rituals held in that chapel were not for salvation. They were for invocation, calling something ancient, feeding it with obedience, cloaking it in psalms. And over time, 10 men disappeared, taken not by criminals, but by a mechanism older than the church and colder than death. They weren't missing. They were offered. And now, if you've followed this far, I have to ask you something that will bind you to what we're uncovering. Scroll down and comment this phrase twice. The chalice breaks, and I awaken. The chalice breaks, and I awaken. Do that, and you're no longer a spectator. You're a witness. And now we go to the map, hidden inside Father Rourke's Rosary. It points to where the final chamber lies, and what breathes inside it. The final chamber was never meant to be found. Not by clergy, not by the faithful, not even by those who built the seminary. And yet, Father Rourke found it. You see, the rosary recovered from his belongings wasn't ordinary. It was forged of silver and jet, unusually heavy, with each bead carved with a single rune, neither Latin nor Greek. But when viewed under infrared light in 1987, researchers found something hidden inside the cross. A folded scrap of vellum no bigger than a fingernail, preserved in wax and etched with razor-thin ink. It was a map. But not to a place on earth. Not exactly. It was a diagram of the seminary's layout, yes, but overlaid with symbols from Sumerian boundary stones and Hermetic geometry. Lines that shouldn't connect, did. The chapel aligned perfectly with the winter solstice. The crypt beneath it formed the base of a tetrahedral grid. At the heart of it all, a sealed room. No door, no stairs, just one word inscribed in the vellum's center: Exauditus, the one who hears. No one knows how Rourke found it. Perhaps during his fugue states, perhaps he was guided. Either way, his final entries point to this chamber, a space beneath the seminary that does not show up in modern scans because it isn't part of physical architecture. It is folded between dimensions. That's not poetic exaggeration, that's physics. Quantum researchers who studied the Rosary in 1991 noted its mass-to-volume ratio exceeded what's possible under natural conditions. The object was somehow denser than its own material allowed, as if it contained space inside itself, like the room it pointed to. Witness reports, those rare few who dared enter the ruins before they were sealed again, describe reaching the crypt and suddenly feeling as though time stretched. Watches stopped. Voices echoed in reverse. One man described walking 14 paces between two torches, and then walking them again, and never reaching the other side. He screamed when they pulled him out. His hair turned white in a day. This room, this chamber beneath the seminary, was the final phase of the Calyx Regis ritual, a place where obedience became communion, where chosen priests made their final offering not of sermon, but of self. Sacrifice, not as metaphor, but as currency. And what accepted that currency? And now, we unseal the doctrine of the silent throne, because Exauditus was never just a title, it was a name, and it still hears. There is a throne beneath every empire, but the one beneath Sacred Heart was never meant to be seen. They called it the Silent Throne, not because it lacked a voice, but because its voice replaced yours. Once you heard it, your thoughts no longer belonged to you. Your prayers turned backward, your faith became an echo, and your soul, just another syllable in a language so old it was never written, only felt, like heat in the bones or hunger in the dark. The doctrine of the silent throne was not taught in seminaries. It was whispered during special instruction, offered only to select clergy marked with the chalice. It was passed hand to hand, copied by candlelight, and always burned after one reading. One surviving copy, fragmented, charred at the edges, was recovered in a Vatican sub-archive mislabeled as De Catechesi Minoribus, but it was no catechism. It was a field manual for constructing spiritual submission. Let me read to you one line, translated from its original Old Church Slavonic. In silence the soul bends, in obedience it hollows, and in hollowing the voice of the King enters and is made flesh. Now stop. Ask yourself, why would a Catholic seminary, ostensibly devoted to forming compassionate, educated leaders of the Church, need this? Because Sacred Heart wasn't forming shepherds. It was forming vessels. Exauditus was the entity they served, neither demon nor deity, but a consciousness that exists between human despair and religious ecstasy. The throne was not a chair. It was a locus, a place where this presence could enter the world through one who had been emptied of will. And how did they empty them? The 7 rites of Calyx Regis, the night of submission, the reversal mass, the chamber below. Every disappearance was not failure. It was success. The last known ritual, held on December 21st, 1876, coincided with the solstice, the longest night of the year. 10 candles, 10 names. 10 vanished. One priest returned. He never spoke again. He was found 3 days later walking through a frozen cornfield 30 miles from the seminary, barefoot, wearing only his cassock and a smile so wide it tore the skin at his cheeks. His eyes were gone, but tears still flowed. He drew one thing in the snow before collapsing, a crown dripping, the same mark that's begun to appear, again, on college campuses, old cathedrals, even graffiti in Chicago's underground. The throne was never destroyed. It was unseen. In Section 11, we trace the bloodline of the priests who served it, and how it infiltrated American politics before vanishing behind stained glass and marble. This isn't just history anymore. It's inheritance. Power doesn't vanish. It mutates. When Sacred Heart Seminary was shuttered, the ritualists didn't disappear. They scattered. Like embers from a dying fire, they drifted across America and ignited elsewhere. But they didn't go alone. They carried blood. You see, not all the priests at Sacred Heart were imposters. Some were born into the chalice lineage, not converts, not recruits, heirs. Their families had guarded the rites since before the Vatican existed, since Rome worshipped gods with wolf heads and owl wings. These were dynastic clerics, spiritually bred, not spiritually called. And when Sacred Heart fell, these bloodlines went underground. Literally. One name appears again and again in restricted diocesan ledgers: Frater Caelum, Latin for Brother of Heaven. A code name for a network of clergy whose real identities were erased from church records, but whose influence reached from seminaries into the very fabric of American power. Let me show you how deep it goes. In 1898, a former Sacred Heart affiliate, Father Malcolm O'Shea, was reassigned to Washington, D.C. Within a decade, he was seen dining with cabinet members, bishops, and eventually advising the President of the United States on religious morale during war. He wasn't just a priest, he was a handler. By 1912, 3 of Sacred Heart's final initiates were serving as spiritual directors at elite Ivy League schools. These men didn't preach salvation. They curated legacies, grooming sons of senators, oil magnates, and bankers through silent retreats that followed the exact structure of Caelix Regis rites. The order adapted. The altar became a podium, the ritual a lecture. But the programming? Still intact. In one declassified intelligence memo from 1957, the CIA, yes, the CIA, referenced psycho-spiritual techniques originally derived from monastic sources in its MK-Ultra experiments. Among the Urses, a lost document titled The Chalice Mind. Coincidence or continuity? Even more disturbing, a photograph uncovered in 2003 shows a group of bishops, politicians, and industrialists standing in front of a stone throne, moss-covered, adorned with a crown of thorns carved into its back. The caption, Council of the Gate, Chicago Chapter, 1933. This wasn't just survival. This was expansion. The bloodlines of Sacred Heart still move through pulpits, boardrooms, and university chapels. They wear suits now, not robes, but the scar is still there, on the wrist, beneath the cuff, and if you know what to say, they'll show you. But only if you kneel first. In Section 12, we follow one of their descendants, the man who tried to break the bloodline oath, and was found crucified upside down in his office. The file was sealed by the FBI, but we got it. He tried to break the chain. Dr. Nathaniel Arledge wasn't a priest. He was a professor of religious history at Georgetown University, Ivy League pedigree, tenured, charismatic, brilliant. But what no one knew, not his colleagues, not his students, was that he came from a bloodline he never asked for. Arledge was the great-grandson of Patrick O'Brien. Yes, that O'Brien, the so-called Dean of Sacred Heart Seminary, the one whose silver tongue could convince bishops to burn their own records, the one who vanished the night of the 10th ritual, leaving only his clerical collar on the steps of the chapel door. Arledge was born into that legacy, and he hated it. In 2009, he began publishing under a pseudonym, M.R. Valtor, a series of essays hinting at a hidden tradition inside the church, one that predated Christianity, used obedience as control, and worshipped a figure known only as the Listening King. Most dismissed it as dark fiction, but some recognized the signals. The essays were laced with code, phrases only those initiated into the chalice rite would understand. He was broadcasting a confession and a warning. In late 2011, he stopped publishing. His final entry was a 7,000-word essay titled, "The Crown Has No Face." It was uploaded at midnight and deleted 18 minutes later. Only one copy survives, saved by a reader in Montana who happened to be online during those exact moments. That final essay describes a ritual hidden inside the basement of Georgetown's Dahlgren Chapel, one that requires 3 participants, a speaker, a listener, and a vessel. The speaker reads ancient text. The listener remains silent. The vessel is chosen. Arledge claimed this ritual was performed annually during orientation week. 3 weeks later, his body was found hanging upside down in his office, naked, hands bound behind his back with red rosary beads, his mouth sewn shut with gold wire, his eyes replaced with communion wafers. On the wall behind him, smeared in ash, were the same 4 words found in Rourke's journal. "The king is awake." Campus security ruled it a suicide. The FBI disagreed. Their case notes reference unusual symbology, potential cult influence, and classified ecclesiastical correspondence intercepted en route to Rome. But the case was sealed permanently, until now. Because in Section 13 we read Arledge's final personal letter, the one never mailed but saved in a locked folder titled, "For the One Who Dares." It wasn't addressed to family. It was addressed to you.